Okay, so let's start with kind of a high-order bits tour of Rails. Over the last few lectures, you guys have seen a lot of the architectural pieces, and now it's time to actually start fitting them together with actual software, because code is sort of where the rubber meets the road for most of us. So what I've got up here is a partial listing of what happens when you create a new Rails application. And what I thought I would do is I would compare it to the big picture diagram that we've seen a number of times. Where's my mouse? There we go. And also for nostalgia, I'll put up a miniature copy of a slide that goes with each topic. Maybe the imagery will trigger something in that primitive part of your brain that does pattern recognition and was able to keep you from getting eaten by tigers. So we already saw that the apps are model view controllers. Remember we had a slide where we talked about each entity in the app, like a movie or a moviegoer, had essentially its own model, its own set of views, and its own controllers. And in the big picture scheme of things, we find those down here when we sort of zoom inside of the application server tier. We also played around a little bit with HTML and CSS, cascading style sheets. Here's a reminder of a slide that we saw of how you can write CSS selectors to select elements for styling in an HTML document. And in terms of our diagram, we are over here. We learned about routes, and we're going to learn about them again today. We're going to see them over and over again because I know they're a little confusing. This is one of the pieces of machinery that people new to the framework have some trouble with. So you'll get plenty of opportunities to review. But you remember that we were talking about how routes map URIs and methods to things that are going to happen in your controller method. And that means in terms of our picture, there's this link between the presentation tier, which receives the URIs, and the logic tier, which is where your code actually runs, right? So in this connection is kind of where the routes do their magic. And we saw that in the persistence tier, at least for development, we're going to use this really simple SQLite database. So in terms of our picture, we're over here in the persistence tier. As we'll talk about today, there's actually multiple different databases for your app. There's one just for when you develop, there's one for when you're doing testing, and there's the real one in production, which is golden, and you never ever touch it because it has your customer's data in it. Okay, so how do these things map onto Rails as a framework? Again, on the right, we've seen this picture before. It's sort of the generic view of here's the browser and each of the three tiers of the three-tier architecture. So if you look inside the your application box, there's controllers, which rely on the routing subsystem. The controllers talk to models. Remember, this is all how model view controller works. We mentioned briefly, and we'll see in more detail today, that models store their data persistently by putting it into tables in a relational database, in our case. And the controllers are in charge of causing views to be rendered, which we've been using HAML, which turns into HTML, as the way to express what our view markup is. And in terms of code, what we're going to see is that over the next few segments is that the models are essentially subclasses of active record base, which is a very useful collection of behaviors for connecting your models to the database. It's called an object relational mapping layer, or an ORM layer. The views, again, subclasses of action view. There's a bunch of reusable behaviors Rails provides to make easy to manipulate views and put views together. And surprisingly, the controller is subclass from application controller, which again provides a bunch of common functionality that you can use in all different controllers in your app. So with that in mind, let's actually see in what order the moving parts are exercised if we take a little trip through an app. The first thing that happens when a URI arrives is that the routes file is consulted to map that URI and the HTTP method, like get or post, to the appropriate controller action. And if there's any optional parameters, those are going to get extracted. So concretely, imagine that we hit our local rotten potatoes with /movies/3. If we look in routes.rb, we'll see that there's a route generated for matching /movie/ a wildcard. And I'm using colors here to indicate the correspondence between different elements, right? So here's the route has matched. ID is going to be a wildcard. That's what the colon is for. And the route that's generated by routes.rb says we're going to use the show action in the movies controller when we get a match on that route. Next thing that happens, now that we know what controller method we're going to call, the controller method gets control of the show, and it can start setting up instance variables that are going to be used by the views. And as we'll see, the way the views are arranged is that their subdirectories and file names match the action names and the controller names, so it's easy to remember. So in this case, what does that mean? Here's what our controller method might look like. Again, I've used color to indicate that the part of the route that indicates the action, that's what the controller method name is. params ID is going to be available to us because one of the things the routing subsystem does is it matches up these wildcard tokens beginning with a colon to the corresponding parts of the URL, and it sticks them into the params hash for us. And again, I'm lying, right? Params isn't really a hash, but it, okay? It quacks like a hash, so we can pretend that it is one. So in our simple controller method, what we might be doing is using that ID to look up something in the movies table of the database. We're going to assign it to this instance variable because that's the only way that we can communicate information to the views. Right? So this ID variable, this is just a local variable inside the controller method. Once the controller method is over, that variable goes out of scope. It's invisible. So if we want the view to be able to get at any information, we have to use instance variables to do that. And when the controller action renders a view, here's an example snippet of what it might look like. We can make use of the instance variables that were set up in the controller to stick stuff into the view. And again, I'm using color to indicate that the controller name from the route tells us what the controller's file name is going to be, and also tells us which subdirectory to look for the view. The action tells us which controller method is going to be called, and it also tells us the base file name of the view. Now, this doesn't seem like a huge deal. We're going to see many more examples of this. It's called convention over configuration. In a lot of earlier app frameworks, you'd have to have a whole separate file whose entire purpose in life was basically to explicitly say what these correspondences were. Right? But because we know that in Ruby you've got reflection and metaprogramming, you can ask objects about themselves, those techniques are actually used so that in the common case, if you follow these conventions, you actually don't need any of those config files. Very good stuff. So that brings us to the sort of two big pieces of Rails philosophy. One of them, which we just saw, is convention over configuration, which really just means if you're willing to follow certain conventions on how you name things, then you never need configuration files or any other information to say how the pieces fit together. It's not to say that you have to do this. And in fact, for every place where Rails provides a default based on convention over configuration, there's always a way to override it. But most of the time, the defaults will be perfectly adequate, and it saves you a lot of typing and extra files to keep track of. So for example, what we just saw is that the show action in the movies controller, well, we know where to find it. It's movies_controller.rb in the controllers directory. And we know that by default, it will try to find a view in the movies subdirectory with the same name as the controller action, in this case, show. So you'll love convention over configuration. It's very cool. The second one, don't repeat yourself, dry, featuring our charming towel icon. For some reason, it reminds me of the gym. But the idea is that there's a number of mechanisms that you can use to extract common functionality so that you don't find yourself sort of pasting the same variation of the same piece of code in 25 different places. And what we'll do is, as we see more examples of these in Rails, I'll try to bring these icons back. And eventually you'll decide that whoever designed them, you hate them because you're going to see them through this whole class. But they're beautiful icons, and we hope that they'll remind you that there's real value to using the Ruby language features in order to get your code to be dry and to avoid needless and repetitive configuration.